Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marie Harf, the Executive Director here at Perry World House. Thank you all for coming today. For those of you who are new to us, Perry World House is the University of Pennsylvania's hub for global engagement, where we bridge the gap between academia and policymakers on the world's most pressing issues. Our work is structured around four thematic pillars: security, democracy, climate change, and human rights and global justice. I am excited to introduce a very special event today, which is co-sponsored by Penn Engineering. We live in a time when the global security landscape is evolving fast, with tensions and conflict in every region of the world. In addition to traditional geopolitical factors, these evolutions are driven in part by new and emerging technologies, including, of course, AI. And cybersecurity is no longer a separate and siloed field, but absolutely critical to everything that national security experts, and I would also say universities, as we've seen this past week, work on today. In that context, what are the largest threats that the United States faces today in the cyber domain? How should policymakers navigate and address them? To answer these questions and many more, we are honored to have with us today General Timothy Haugh, former director of the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, positions he held until April of this year. General Haugh was commissioned in the Air Force in 1991 and spent much of his career working on issues related to intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and cybersecurity. He served more than 30 years in the Air Force, culminating, as I mentioned, in his assignment as the 4th commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the 19th director of the National Security Agency. In these roles, Haugh served as the national manager for all federal government national security systems and led all U.S. Department of Defense cyber operations. During his career, Haugh commanded at the squadron, group, wing, numbered Air Force, and joint levels. And importantly for us here at Penn, he is a native of Hughesville, Pennsylvania. He will be in conversation today with Dr. Michael C. Horowitz, the Richard Perry Professor and Faculty Director here at Perry World House. Before giving the floor to our speakers, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Ted Schlein, whose generous support made this event possible and also made possible all of Perry World House's other work on emerging technologies and global politics. Now, without further ado, please help me welcome our speakers to the stage.
Hey, everybody. Great to have you all here today, and welcome to Perry World House, sir. I guess a place to start would be, what Marie, our executive director, just laid out was, this incredible career in national security, in intelligence, sort of broadly. But for the audience here, that includes, students that do anything from, maybe computer science to political science to English, for, like members of the Penn and Perry World House community. Tell us a little bit more about your background.
First, thanks. It's an honor to be here. I'm really excited to be able to engage today on a number of different topics. And really, from my standpoint, where I started, in a small town in central Pennsylvania of 1,200 people, my dad had been Marine. And he had really instilled in me the idea of service. I just didn't think it was going to be in the United States Marine Corps. And I ultimately went on an Air Force ROTC scholarship to Lehigh. And while there, I experienced a pretty classic liberal arts experience, which is every class that I took, I was just thrilled with. And I thought, I really want to study more of that. And ultimately, where I found myself was really interested in Soviet studies and saw myself becoming a Sovietologist. And as I entered the Air Force,
I didn't know that. Sorry, that's great. But also, very clearly delineates when you were in college.
Yes, it does. And it also will tell you a little bit about maybe my skills as a future intelligence officer, that I became my vision was to become a Sovietologist minutes before the wall came down. So that might just give you a little sense. But the Air Force decided to make me a signals intelligence officer. And I didn't know what that meant. I had never heard of it. I went and found the manual, and it said, computer scientist, electrical engineer. And I put my hand up, and I'm like, Russian studies is neither of those. But when I learned what the business was and went to my first National Security Agency site and my first assignment, really learned how important it was to our national security and just really enjoyed it. I wanted to make that a part of what our career would look like. And what I did realize is I needed to get a more technical degree. So I went back to school. I got a master's in science and telecommunications from Southern Methodist University. And that ended up becoming foundational, which was experience in NSA, experience then in a more technical discipline, put me in a position when we were searching to build our first hacking units. They needed leaders that had worked with NSA, had some technical bona fides, and had some success in previous assignments. There was a pretty short list. And so I think serendipity plays a role in each of our lives. And for me, being able to stand up the first Air Force hacking unit and then leading to successive jobs that increased in responsibility, culminating in director of NSA and the commander of Cyber Command. But a proud Pennsylvanian, live in State College, Pennsylvania. And I'm a Penn State fan, so I'm really resilient.
So let's move from you to the world, and a lot. Certainly, your career has been characterized by a bunch of different eras in some ways of American national security, from the like everything is great 1990s, like up until today. But the last several years, conversations about U.S.-China competition have dominated the national security community, from Intel to the Pentagon to the State Department. From your perspective, how real is that competition between the U.S. and China? How big a deal is it, and how did that play out in your roles?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, when we think about the competition with China, it really comes back to our economy is the engine of our national security, and it's the underpinnings of everything we do. And so when you start from that premise, you then think about what are those core areas that we're competing. We're clearly having a competition in cyber. And cybersecurity has a direct nexus with our national security and with our economic security. But I think when you look at the competition that's underway from a technology perspective, there are going to be critical things that are going to occur that will have impacts, not just on the United States, but on the global economy. And how we bear out what it looks like for the application of artificial intelligence, who's going to drive that technology, and how it's going to be employed, both from an ethical perspective and from a national security context, is a contest that's certainly underway. And we could go very deep in the discussion of what it looks like every day to compete from either an intelligence perspective, where nations are trying to gain advantage over one or the other, and the approach that we've taken both from democracies and from autocracies, as well as when we think about the contest in cyberspace and the implications for intellectual property and for how we would gain advantage in potential future conflict. Those issues all become pretty intertwined quickly when we think about a contest between China and the United States.
Well, let's go a little bit deeper on the cyber element of that then. And obviously there are things you can tell us and there are things you can't tell us. But how would you characterize that kind of cyber competition between the United States and China? We see public reports of hacks, of damage, of issues. Like how big a deal is it?
Yeah, it's significant. Now, what we have attempted to do in the U.S. government is produce more things that are unclassified. So if you go to nsa.org today, you will find a page that lists in great detail China's hacking campaigns, their methodology, their tradecraft. And the reason to do that is so you can enable this type of conversation. Let's have a very clear, unclassified conversation about China's intentions and their methodology, so that you can then have that conversation with industry, you can have that conversation with foreign partners. But when you look at where we have been successful as a nation, our intelligence community is exceptional. And it takes our entire community. And what every nation has done since the beginning of the establishment of the nation state is intelligence allows you to have an advantage. Your ability to be able to put your decision makers in a situation where they have an advantage in information is something that our intelligence community does every single day for policymakers. And we also do that for our military commanders. So as China looks and observes how we have acted as the United States, that advantage is an area that they are trying to replicate. They see how we interact with both the national intelligence community down to tactical commanders, and then also where our policymakers have an advantage. when you think back to the beginning of Russia-Ukraine, when the United States exposed intelligence about the plans and intelligence of Russia and their intent to invade Ukraine, that was information that came from our intelligence community, our relationships, our partners, and our ability. That was something that China cannot necessarily replicate. That is still an advantage that we carry. But what they are trying to do is replicate that ability in a different way, where we have invested a significant amount in satellites, in our people, and all these different things. They're replicating it through building out of cyber capacity. NSA, CIA, DHS, industry partners, and foreign partners put out a report in the end of August. And it lays out in detail how China is attempting to replicate a global intelligence collection architecture, but doing it through cyber. And that is an area that they've clearly invested. It's part of their doctrine. They've said exactly what they're doing. And now we've documented in great detail how they've used those cyber capabilities to collect not just targeting the United States, but nations around the world, starting by hacking the telecommunications infrastructures of those nations.
I want to pick up actually on the Russia-Ukraine example, because that was, it's very striking when it happened, the way that the, United States had clearly declassified a bunch of information that, showed the war was coming, and also how other countries, even when presented with that information, did not necessarily believe us. And, what goes into those kind of thoughts about when to reveal that kind of, when to reveal that kind of information, whether the sort of Russia-Ukraine case, information about what China was doing, what China sort of does in the cyber domain, because let me tell you, even as someone that worked in the Pentagon, the NSA is not known for its timely email responses, or its public messaging. And so, what's the, so when you do it, obviously means a lot, but, how did you think about that?
Well, first, one of the things I think there's two things I think we're just incredibly proud of at the National Security Agency. One is how much every individual that works there is every day thinking about how do they protect every American, both from a threats perspective, but also to protect their civil liberties. It's core to the ethos of how intelligence operations are done, and it's really critical to how we think about it. So when you start to think about your role of let's defend every American, then in most cases, it's who do you partner with that has an ability to do that? So the partnership that exists between the National Security Agency and the FBI is hand in glove in terms of being able to counter threats. And that has developed since 9/11. The culture of collaboration and sharing based off the changes in the law that came out of 9/11, but then also the change in culture in the organizations, which if there's a threat, how can we get that information to someone that can action it? That doesn't mean we tell everybody in the world we did it. If the FBI comes out and said they were successful and they countered a threat and there's no credit for anybody in the IC, that works perfectly, right? We protect how we got the information, but there was a threat that was averted, whether that was a terrorist threat, whether it was fentanyl entering the country, whether it was something that there was a plot against an ally. Those things being disrupted is the feedback that we want to receive, not the public side of that aspect, because we want to protect how we gain that information, and being able to mask that's critical. So when you get into something that is obviously so geopolitically charged as nation states potentially going to war, I think from an intelligence perspective, the information we gain is only as useful as its purpose. And I think that's where within the intelligence community, we've learned tradecraft following 9/11 that it now allows us to do things that are differently. And where we built an ability to do counterterrorism operations that is unparalleled in terms of how the intelligence community interacts with special operations forces and works with other nations to counter threats globally. That culture of how you work to produce an outcome can equally be transferred to if you're trying to stop the subversion of U.S. technology by China. That's a different disruption activity, but it's the same methodology. If it's to stop a Russian information operation for a false flag, it's a different outcome, but it's the same approach of operationalizing intelligence. I think what was done expertly at that time, taking a lot of people that had counterterrorism experience and having them work Russia, brought a different culture to how you use the data that we understand about Russia. And likewise, very similar experience in how we think about China.
So how do you, well, let's start with the flip side of it maybe, and this might be shorter and your answer might be no, but we're talking a lot, we've talked a lot about in some ways America's adversaries or potential adversaries, the countries like China and in Russia. Are there opportunities for cooperation in whether in cyber or elsewhere, sort of in your mind, between the U.S. and in some of those kinds of countries? Are there like commons essentially to protect in the cyber domain? How should we be thinking about those kinds of opportunities?
Well, I think first, one of the things that I did on my first day as the director of NSA and the commander of Cyber Command is I signed 104 letters to foreign partners because they were integral to how we thought about these issues.
I thought you were going to say you circled China on a map and put like a red dot.
No, I think we already got that. Yeah. We got that. That map was already on the wall. So when you look at the issues that many of these nations face, is around the idea that you have this large nation state that has built an immense capacity in cyber, and how they're employing that is putting that nation in a disadvantage. And so being able to have a conversation with another nation that says, here is what they're doing, here's the technology, and here's how we could help you discover this activity, is really a significant part of being a really good partner, where we're taking knowledge that we have to allow them to enhance their national security, and seeing measurable effect for that is a lot of opportunity space for us being a good partner, but also to build trust from a nation-to-nation perspective. So you will see a significant amount of reporting that has been put out about China or Russia or Iranian activity globally, the techniques they're using, and then that's a catalyst for a conversation that says, okay, how do we work together? Because it's in our best interest for those nations to be less capable, China, Russia, or Iran, in how they're operating in cyberspace, but also how to make our friends more capable. And then in many cases, they're going to bring technology or an insight that looks different than our lens. And so that collaboration just becomes really important.
We'll come back to cyber. Let's shift away for a second to talk about something you mentioned in your answer to the background question, or maybe the broad competition question, which is artificial intelligence. And that there's probably no technology that has grown more in public awareness, at least over the last several years. If you think about since the first ChatGPT was released, I think in 2022. So how did why don't we start with, like, over the course of your career, when and how did advances in artificial intelligence start to shape what you were doing, and how were you thinking about that then in your final posting at Cybercom and the NSA?
Yeah, I think for us within the intelligence community, we've had a long experience with artificial intelligence. Obviously, the National Security Agency, we deal with large amounts of information, how we process that, how we do it most effectively. We have used artificial intelligence for decades. But it has been very different with the application of generative AI and frontier models. But at our core, we have a workforce that's highly technical, that understands how to integrate new technology. So I think from that perspective, we started with a very different frame. So when I think about it from an NSA perspective, obviously one of the things that we have to be able to do is process large amounts of language. So human language translation, our ability to apply technology, that's something we've done for a long period of time. These models have now caught up and now surpassed where we were in terms of our leveraging of that technology. So how do you appropriately leverage it? Now, one of the things that we bring as a requirement that is different than everyone else is we have to know where every piece of information was acquired, what authority it was under, and then we have to ensure that we are protecting American civil liberties in the processing of every bit of that information. So we do have requirements that look different, because we want to ensure that Congress can see exactly what we've done and why we've done it, and also to be able to have that conversation. So that in the NSA context. Previously, when I worked in Air Force ISR, and we did intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations.
Yeah, I was about to say, could you tell us about what ISR is?
Yeah, so this is really about our ability to do surveillance of the battlefield. And you can very easily think about what it looks like today, what we would describe as drones. At that point, we had unmanned aerial vehicles that we flew around in, really in Iraq, Afghanistan, other places where there were counterterrorism operations that allowed us to survey the battlefield. And what we would find is we just had to apply a lot of humans to be able to go through that video to identify threats. And there was clearly opportunities to integrate artificial intelligence. But what we found at that moment, which was really in the mid-teens, the technology wasn't ready for it. And so now what does that mean for us as we go forward, particularly organizations that are dealing with something that would be from a camera versus a different type of communication sensor? We're seeing commonality now in terms of how you can use the technology to break it down in ways that you can combine data. And that has implications for us both from a positive perspective in terms of being able to identify threats faster, but it also brings a whole series of privacy and civil liberties issues that you have to think your way through to ensure that you're doing the right thing that are consistent with our laws and our values.
So let's pick up on the risk side a little bit. There's lots of concern out there about applications of artificial intelligence and questions of hacking, data poisoning, spoofing, hallucinations of generative models, like all of those kinds of things. How much of a risk, is that, and how should the average person be thinking about that in the context of maybe like their own uses of generative AI, or how should we think about it from a national security context?
So I think from individuals' perspectives, I just encourage everybody to keep experimenting with the technology, right? It is certainly impactful, and it can have impacts on everyone in terms of how you process information, but then also how you interact. If for the first time you may want to write a program, and you can do that today so easily with the power of this technology. And what is that experiment, and what could that mean for you? Now, set aside now personal applications and really think about it from a national security perspective. I think we do have areas that we would be concerned about of the safety of the models from attack. And those could be how people use the model or abuse the models. There's a really interesting report this morning from Google that walked through individual campaigns that they can now link those campaigns to techniques that were explored through Gemini, their large language model, and how the technology was abused to be able to enhance a hacking campaign. They've identified it, they're publishing it. That's a really good, I appreciate that they're publicly doing that. Anthropic has done a whole series of, another one of the very large language model providers has done a whole series of reports on safety where the model is doing something they didn't anticipate. And it's operating outside of what they believed was the original safety parameters, and trying to now research what is causing that. So those are things inside the models themselves are going to have to continue to evolve in terms of safety, and what are what will safeguards be expected both by nations and by businesses and by consumers. On the national security side, what we fully see today is the advantage of using these types of tools go to the attacker. In the short term, the ability to enhance an offensive hacking campaign, these tools are really helpful. Not necessarily in creating new things, but automating sections of those operations that can just make it easier for any hacking campaign, whether that's ransomware or a nation state.
Oh, great.
Now, I'm an optimist, so flipping to what's the future look like? These technologies are going to allow us to secure the underlying computer code in ways we've not done before. How rapidly it can do that, and to what degree it stays in front, will be one of our tests. And then there's a whole different emerging set of capabilities on defensive cyber that show an enormous amount of promise, but they're going to take time to implement. And that gap between when defensive capabilities that can fully leverage this technology, when we can leverage this technology to reduce the amount of vulnerabilities in computer code that's produced, versus the advantage that's coming to hackers, how fast that closes is going to be one of the things we're going to have to watch closely.
Oh, that's fascinating. I have a follow-up, but just so everybody knows, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to open this up for questions. So please start thinking about them, and please start thinking about them and be ready. All right, but for real, we need advice here at Penn. We got hacked last week. As you might, the no, sorry, it was actually horrible. But jokes aside, the like for the average person or organization, like you obviously have like a wealth of like training and understanding about this in the sort of highest threat environment where the U.S. government and U.S. national security agencies are being, there's 24/7, 365 essentially like intrusion attempts. What are best practices that maybe people or organizations should be thinking about to either protect their own information or for companies?
Yeah, I have empathy for all the cybersecurity professionals at Penn. Having been responsible for one of the largest networks in the world in the Department of Defense, it was never a good day when something happened somewhere around the world and you're telling your boss, by the way, we got hacked today.
Yeah.
So I have empathy. I think there are a couple of things so for individuals, really understanding when you look at your device, so everybody's got a phone, how you protect your identity in relation to that is probably one of the most critical things. How you manage your passwords, how you move to passkeys to get away from passwords, like that basic set of controlling who you are and how you are perceived digitally is just the most critical thing that you can protect. There's still right now the most very basics are the things that our individuals are affected by, and that's spear phishing, clicking on a link from an individual. We've seen a massive uptick in also approaches that are coming to you. I mean, how many of you today got a, hey, how are you doing text from someone? And they're being very successful at beginning an interaction that ultimately will end with a link of some kind that they will want you to click on. And it's going to get more and more difficult to discern truth from false and how these models are going to be able to generate video of individuals and other. So being really understanding what your own personal identity is and controlling that is probably the most important thing. For organizations, it's around getting the basics right, trying to make sure that everything that is being patched needs to be patched, but it's also knowing what data you need to protect and then putting your resources and aligning it to that. And that can be done in our own personal lives, or it can be done organizationally, is what data do you want to ensure, whether for companies, that can be their intellectual property. It will always be customer data. It could be student data, or it could be research. Whatever those things are, that's where you really put your resources to be able to ensure that defense. You do the basics for everything, but ensuring you understand what data is most important to the institutions becomes absolutely critical. And for most of us, that's our financial data in our own lives.
So are those principles then how we should also think about this in the context of critical infrastructure, sort of moving more back into the policy space? Since if what you are talking about is an increased velocity of cyber attacks that are increasingly AI enabled in a way that gives advantage to the offense, then tell me something to make me feel better then about risk when it comes to protecting critical infrastructure.
I'm not going to tell you a lot that's going to make you feel better about critical infrastructure. So for everyone,
This is going great.
Yeah, one of the campaigns that China has run is something called Volt Typhoon. We labeled it as Volt Typhoon. It is the targeting of critical infrastructure in the United States and with our allies. And when I say critical infrastructure, there are a number of segments that we have identified as being critical to the execution of national security across the United States. Examples of that are air traffic control, our pipelines, our water, our electrical power grid. Those are examples of critical infrastructure. China has targeted critical infrastructure that we have assessed that we believe it is in advance of a potential crisis with the United States to be able to hold things at risk that would require our politicians to be focused on our critical infrastructure rather than a crisis abroad. And the things that I have found most concerning in that is in particular the targeting of water. That there is no intelligence value from collecting on a water system in rural the United States. There's only an opportunity to try to hold that at risk. And what you will find in many of these infrastructure providers is they don't have a cybersecurity organization. So if you're in small town Pennsylvania, you're just trying to keep the water clean and safe and available for all of the people that live in your constituency.
Which seems reasonable as a priority.
And now if a nation state is chosen to target that, they're really ill-equipped to deal with it. And so as we've identified this series of threats, it's now, one, what does the government do about that? So I think we can set that aside, but there's work the government should do to make that an area that would be unacceptable for any nation to target. From our perspective, we have very clear rules that we follow in any military operation about what you target and why. It has to have military necessity, and you would never target a civilian population in the same manner. So as we think about that, how do you as a nation make that untenable? And the other side is we have to make it more secure. And this is where I think from the longer term perspective, can we take advantage of the technology to be able to buy down these risks? We have a lot of common components across our critical infrastructure made by a small group of vendors. How do we make their code more secure? And then where are the appropriate investments, either at the local, state, or federal government level, for the things we have to ensure are available, and how we think about that. So I think there's a combination of investment, but there's also actions we should be taking as a nation that says this is unacceptable.
All right, I have a very long, I'm gonna ask one more question, and I'm gonna open it up. So please be ready with your questions. I have a long list of AI questions, actually, I would love to ask you, but but let me conclude this segment here on leadership, in that you led two essentially of America's most largest, most important, most impactful national security organizations. How did you think about the challenge of sort of leading that organization, and do you have any have any lessons for us?
Well, I think much of this is the conversation we're having. Is one of the things that is just so valuable about serving is seeing the fruits of your labor. And from both the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, every day we were engaged in some sort of interaction with an adversary that was about, could we put our nation in some form of advantage in terms of what we're trying to achieve, whether that's for the United States, for our citizens, and for our global partners. And so the choices that you make every day is about where do you apply your time and what will be most impactful. And because there certainly are a number of threats that happen around the world, and for an organization like NSA or other elements of the IC, the choices we make about where we put our resources have consequences. And they result in a more secure nation, they save lives, and they also give our policymakers advantages in their ability to produce the outcomes that the American people have asked them to do. So I think for all of us, I think when we think about where we're applying our time, is it going to produce an outcome in a way that's consistent with our laws, our values? And that is exciting. Like, I think from both organizations, I couldn't have been more proud of the focus on the outcomes and doing it in a way that I think we're incredibly proud of the protection of civil liberties as a part of that process.
All right, let me open it up to the audience. Folks should ask questions. Dean Kumar, sorry, please. We're going to bring around a microphone because we have a audience watching on Zoom as well.
Thank you. So I want to go back to the beginning. You talked about the beauty of a liberal arts education when you started, and think back to today. And what are American universities doing right, and what are we getting wrong? And are we doing the right thing from your standpoint as you think about all kinds of infrastructure, but including cyber infrastructure? What is it that we should be focusing on, especially in an engineering school, but more broadly in a place like Penn?
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging question. Because I would tell you, as a leader of both NSA and cyber,
Dean of the engineering school.
Yes. I didn't think a lot about the liberal arts aspect of that, sitting in those roles. I was thinking a lot about what's the talent that we were bringing in that could fulfill really unique roles. That could be everything from a mathematician that's making code to breaking code to a deep cultural expert in understanding an adversary's behavior. So we were looking for expertise that we could either develop more broadly, but really then bring those skills together. I think what we're seeing in general is an interdisciplinary nature of there are things now that are going to be foundational. That as I've walked and have met many of the leaders across Penn, everyone's dealing with where does artificial intelligence fit? Where does it fit ethically? Where does it fit in terms of the potential to accelerate researcher outcomes? And then where does it become a hindrance in terms of learning basic skills? And those, I think, are going to be the areas that we're all challenged with. And so in government, we spend a significant amount of time thinking about how do you develop that workforce and which are the core sets of skills that you want people to have as the ability to think critically and to question and to challenge, but to also be able to just leverage the technology at a scale and a pace that we needed them to do to produce an outcome. You're dealing with that in the same way, but now trying to struggle with what's the ethical approach that fits in a university model. But I think the interdisciplinary component of finding the commonality is one of the potential strengths that exists across the university in ways that really have a lot of potential for both ethically and to develop individuals.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for the remarks. I have a question about how the United States communicated that this is unacceptable with regards to the Volt Typhoon intrusions. One of the things the US has done frequently in the past is quite detailed attribution on the individuals who have engaged in hacking of US systems, the units, that it didn't do in the case of Volt Typhoon, but there has been plenty of reporting about diplomatic engagement to ask China about or communicate that this is unacceptable. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on how to think about these different methods of communicating where the US's red lines, for want of a better word, might be on these issues.
Yeah, I think first, in the roles that I've had, one of the most important things that we do is we develop options for policymakers. So in reality, for us, it's to be able to inform so that now that can be leveraged by policymakers across our cabinet. And in this case, I think what we can now all look backwards on and say that the lines that we drew in the manner that we drew them haven't been adequate because we've not produced the outcome that we would want to achieve, which is, to me as a military professional, it's unconscionable to think that a foreign military would be holding our citizens at risk. And that is something that we should, as a nation, deem as unacceptable. Now, the manner in which we provide that feedback, there's multiple ways to do that. But I also think there's strengths that we're not fully leveraging today that make it more difficult for that to occur. Today, how we do interaction between the federal government and our industry is an area still ripe with opportunity to think about how we collectively defend our nation. And if we think through that lens, we would think about it slightly differently. And I'll give you just a little example. If you go back to the original Volt Typhoon reporting that was put out first by Microsoft and then the combined reporting that came out from the federal government, 13 industry partners, and a number of foreign partners. We've proven that we can do a campaign together between government and industry that makes it almost impossible for that China campaign to continue. We can do that episodically. What we've not been able to do is do that every day. And there are structural barriers that limit our ability to do that. Because we've originally said the goal is for industry and government to share information. We've done that. That's not adequate for the scope and scale of threat. It's how do we cooperate between telecommunications providers, the cybersecurity industry, which is immense in the United States, the capabilities of the federal government to be able to contribute, and then how does that come together in a way that makes it very difficult for a nation state to target our critical infrastructure? Those are the things that I think are opportunity in front of us. But we first have to be able to be very declarative. And I think Congress has attempted to be very declarative we have not been clear from an executive branch perspective as to where we draw some of those lines. And there's opportunity there.
All right, let's go to the middle of the room here for a student, and then we'll go up to Trudy after that.
Thank you so much for coming. I had a question regarding Russia, and this is especially relevant because we talk a lot about cyber defense. And when Russia conducts hybrid warfare activities against the U.S., election interference, targeting the electrical grid, we don't talk a lot about how we should respond to that in terms of the cyber domain. How do you think the U.S. should respond either offensively or in other ways to Russia's, cyber attacks?
So I think first, it's a great question. I've had the great joy of testifying both in classified and unclassified sessions on this question, because it is a difficult one about where do we, as a nation, how do we view and in particular, we normally characterize things that you'll see around an event as an attack. In some cases, it is an attack. In some cases, it's a prepositioning event for something in the future. And so we do need to be very thoughtful about how we communicate how we view as unacceptable. Because certainly if there is a cyber attack on our infrastructure that produces an outcome, we're going to respond as a nation. It's a matter of what tool we use. And what I would be an advocate of is, let's think about all of our instruments of national power, our economic interests, our economic ability, our information, our military, and our diplomatic. How did those come together in a response? Because if you're thinking about responding to Russia, a response in kind, they may not care at all. Like if their citizens are deprived of something, they do that to them on a daily basis. So how it impacts us may not impact them. But as a commander of Cyber Command, I would always want to be able to give an option to our policymakers that said, here is how cyber could contribute to a national response that included our diplomacy, our information, our partners, and our military, likely also some economic component that would then try to change that adversary's behavior. But it's got to be an ingredient, but I think we have many other strengths that we want to bring together in a response.
Trudy.
General, I wonder if you could talk about the risks of the politicization of our cyber defenses. As you know best, there's been a lot of churn this year, and the manner of your leaving the reorganization of Cyber Command, people leaving, and a temporary suspension of offensive cyber operations against Russia. So how do you see things as they stand now? Has our ability to respond been affected? And what are the risks going forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Before you answer, I'm definitely going to call on a student next. And so if you are a student and you have not raised your hand yet, hi, Ellie and Allie. Don't think I won't just call on you.
So I think first, big picture, cybersecurity is a bipartisan issue. And I think that has been very clear to me in terms of my engagements with Congress and my engagements with both administrations. The manner now is the how, and how that will be approached going forward. Clearly, within the federal government today, there's less capacity in terms of each organization. And we've seen that very demonstratively inside of DHS in terms of the shrinking of the workforce. Every organization has gotten smaller. There are implications to that. Now, the piece that I don't know, in any organization, when you go through that, which is not unusual in an administration to change resources, this has been more extreme in terms of the number of resources. The leaders are going to have to manage the risk. I don't know how they're managing that risk today, but that is a normal day-to-day function. What are the things that we would do that are the highest priority that we're going to continue to align resources to? So I think now what you're going to see emerge, now that there is a national cyber director identified in Sean Cancross, he has the challenge of what is going to be the national strategy in this administration, and doing it in an environment that the federal government has less capacity. There's still immense capability in the federal government, but what will the ingredients be? The previous administration had chosen regulation as one of the core components of how to raise the floor of cybersecurity across industry and government. We know this administration will not do that. And Mr. Cancross has talked about voluntary programs that would enhance the cybersecurity across industry. That will be a difficult test in terms of what is everyone's vested interest in doing that. But I think from my perspective at this point, I think we owe Sean the opportunity to write that strategy and say, how are we going to bring together those strengths that we have across industry and government to make us more secure? But there will now need to be more placed upon industry because there is less capacity in the federal government.
Sweet. Appreciate the time. So I'm wondering, you're talking about like computer vision and bringing in, ingesting a lot of video during your career. How do you foresee an ideal relationship between industry and government for training models in that space? And more specifically, when you talk about frontier models, a lot of them are, not at your Apples or your necessarily Anthropics. So allowing those companies to have access to that data to properly train without being, a huge security risk. How do you foresee that, and how do you see it in an ideal space working?
So I think we thought about it through a couple of different ways. So one of the approaches that we took is bring in an open source model to be a foundational component that allowed our workforce to interact with the technology. And so being able to allocate compute and a model that allowed everybody in the workforce to be able to interact with it. Separately, we were working across the federal government and across the IC, which is how do we bring in frontier models and do that in a way that's consistent with our ability to be able to also understand what data we're using and how we are making sure we can audit all of that data. So that's a classified systems control of our data conversation. The last piece is around how do you train the models. And so what our approach generically was, let's think about how you leverage a model that has been trained 90% on unclassified information. And then how do you bring it into an environment where you can now do a tailored bit of training that's in your context. So if it's NGA, slightly different, think about the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and their focus on imagery versus the National Security Agency's focus on how we're going to interact with digital data in a different way. But trying to also manage that in a way that said, can I leverage a much cheaper contract to do the 90% and then have a tailored contract that gets me to the 10% inside of an environment that we control with our own data? So we're thinking through very similar things. Every organization has to think through what data are you going to use to train and who are you going to give it access to. And I think we felt very comfortable that we had a mechanism to do that in the national security context. But I think each university is also thinking about how you handle research, how you handle student data, and ensuring that it's used in a way that's consistent with whatever agreements you've made. Great question.
All right, yeah. So we have a question from online, and then we'll go there.
Thank you so much for being here. Do you have a view on creating a cyber force? Could you briefly outline how cyber agencies, military intelligence community are coordinating, and how structures should evolve to fully recognize cyber as a fifth domain?
So one of the things Congress asked the commander of Cyber Command to do was to lead a study on what's the future organizational construct of the department and how we organize cyber. And having grown up in this, I've certainly been a part of their military services have a role, U.S. Cyber Command has a role, the National Security Agency, and how that comes together is really what's the most appropriate way. So we did a study and we looked really closely at two different models. The first model was built on the approach that was done to create United States Special Operations Command, empowering the commander of U.S. SOCOM to have acquisition authority, to have personnel authority over certain aspects of the Special Operations Force, and to be able to grow inside there, leveraging each of the services as partners to be able to build a Special Operations Force and capabilities necessary to conduct those missions. So that's one model. The second model is to build a new military service or a military department. And in what that would ultimately mean is carving cyber capacity out of the other services and creating a new military service, similar to what we did with the Space Force. Little different because the Space Force was largely carved out of the Air Force, where you took a large segment of it, moved it into a new service. In this case, it would be cutting out larger chunks of each military service into a new cyber service. What we concluded in the study is both of those potentials are viable, but they have different implications. One of the biggest challenges we have as cyber as a domain is it is the only domain that we have for warfare that's not defined by physics. So where does it begin and end? When you get into a bureaucracy as large as the Department of Defense, if you cannot say, like in space, we could say everything that operates above this geographic boundary is part of the Space Force. Done. Straightforward. Where does cyber begin and end? Is it just the offensive force? Is it the force that operates a network? Is it the element within the F-35 program that is building the network for sustainment?
Is it the people that installed the monitors on your desk?
So all of that becomes a complex part of the conversation. And so what I recommended to the secretary was that we enhance the Special Operations Command model. It's already in the law. Commander of Cyber Command has acquisition authority. The Commander of Cyber Command can have personnel authorities. The Commander of Cyber Command is responsible for the advanced training within the Department of Defense. All of those things Congress has told us to go do, we just haven't put policy in place to do it. And we haven't resourced it at the necessary level to be able to produce all of the outcomes that the nation is asking for. And so from my perspective, it's the most straightforward was to build out Cyber Command because you could actually be investing in teeth as opposed to if you created a military service, you're going to be investing in bureaucracy. It doesn't mean that if you make that investment today to grow out a more capable Cyber Command, that if you chose in the future to move some of those things into military service, it wouldn't stop you from doing that. But I do think that the idea that you're going to change a cultural problem by putting a cyber service inside of the Department of the Army means you're just moving it to a different cultural problem. So if you really wanted to do it, you shouldn't be thinking about building a military service. You should build a new military department that has all of the authorities and responsibilities and the ability to build culture. I think we could build that culture in Cyber Command if you gave the talent management authority to the Commander of Cyber Command. So that was my input to multiple studies that have looked at this.
All right, well, one last question here, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks for your great talk today. So you mentioned a couple of times different levers that we might use to improve security. You mentioned the prior administration like regulation, maybe this one would not. You mentioned the need for public-private partnerships. We have critical infrastructure, it's private, but the public has an interest in it. So I guess what I wonder is, whichever strategy we choose to take, do you feel like we will know that it was successful? In other words, do we have the data that we could use to be able to analyze before and after to say, yeah, this strategy that required no regulation was a winner compared to an alternative strategy? And if we don't have the capacity to answer that question, we're missing some data. What do you think that would be and how would we get it?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question.
Add on to the end of that, advice for students.
So as I look at it, certainly we would be evaluating the ability of a nation state to be able to target what we value. Like that would be the empirical data that I think I would be graded upon, is as an organization that's responsible for defense of critical infrastructure outside the United States and also for securing national security systems, which are all of our classified systems, our ability to have confidence that we've done that and we've made it more difficult for an adversary to be able to target our infrastructure and our data, including the critical infrastructure that supports Americans. So I would be looking at it through an adversary lens. That's just my bias. I think there are other empirical ways that we would look at that as someone that is securing and operating a network in terms of how they have had to deal with incidents. I think there's also a series of empirical data that our cybersecurity industry has that's pretty unique and capable in terms of incident response. And the number of like the small group of firms that are supporting our Fortune 1000 with incident response has a unique set of data. The other set of data I think that will also be very valuable is insurance data. That as that market continues to have a role, but it hasn't really also found its footing completely. But every time there's an insurance claim done because of a hack, there's another set of empirical data. So I think how we would look at it is through a couple different lenses, whether it be through industries or the governments, but I think you could get a pretty good sense of whether we were making progress. In terms of like advice, when I think about from a student's perspective, is what are areas that could be researched? I'm really intrigued by how Jen Easterly, who was the former director of CISA, put out an article in Foreign Affairs. And she, it was, I don't know if she labeled this article, but it was The End of Cybersecurity is the name of the article.
Let me tell you from personal experience that they do the headlines and do not let you edit them.
I liked her headline because it did at least get attention, but it was about this idea that could we improve code to a point that allows us to buy down the risk in segments of our critical infrastructure. And I think there's an area in there for research that is it viable? And in what conditions does that allow that to accelerate? And then what are the mechanisms to deploy? I think are some of those areas. There's certainly, and also one of the things that I think will now be the test in the deployment of AI for cyber defense, there's going to be a whole new series of vulnerabilities that are going to emerge in the defensive tools, because you're going to have all of these agents that are operating autonomously for defensive purposes that have to be controlled, and they have to be given authorities, and they have to operate independently. That's going to be a long-term strength, but in the short term, that's going to be a vulnerability. And I think you'll see that emerge. So I think in that protocol that has been produced, there's an area of research. And then I think there's also just a political science view of this, which is why does the American population not care about this issue? Like, there are senators that are just beating their head on the table every day saying, why are people not upset that our telecommunications infrastructure was hacked and the implications that has for individuals and businesses?
Because they're on TikTok?
We can do some videos there, but I think those are areas from a political science perspective that are also, why does this issue not matter? And why does cybersecurity not resonate in a way for the individual and for the population writ large? There's opportunity space there. See, I said opportunity to make sure I was positive.
Oh, I love that. Well, thank you for a great conversation today, General Haugh.